I never thought my future would ever look like this, carefree and finally free from the emotional pain of workplace abuse. While I continue to heal from the trauma, I've immersed myself into the subject thanks to the national organization End Workplace Abuse. They have been so instrumental in raising awareness about this pervasive issue. I'm honored to speak with the organization's co-founder, who has been in the trenches for over 10 years, working to pass the Workplace Psychological Safety Act. How were you abused in the workplace? What happened? What's your story?
So I was abused. Well, I think of my official workplace abuse story as happening in 2007, but actually my first job out of college, I worked for a publishing company in New York City, and the first boss that I ever had it was kind of bittersweet that she was the best boss I've ever had, because she kind of set the bar high, but at the same time, people who followed her were, some of them were extremely toxic. So I think in hindsight, the person, or the experience I had directly after her was toxic. There was a lot of, just toxic behavior, unnecessary blame, going on my computer for just to find out what meeting I was at. And it was just behavior that I didn't at the time recognize that was bullying. But in the official situation, I was in a communications role at a school at Boston University, and the one of the assistant deans who I reported to just on a project, she wasn't actually my official boss. She actually really liked working with, it followed the textbook behavior of being charming for a few months.
In the beginning, the honeymoon stage.
Yeah. And so eventually, I worked on relaunching the website. There was a mistake that happened with it that was fixable within I don't know, a half a day, not even. And this person had no background in web design. So we relaunched the website. And instead of just saying, I got you help to use as you see fit, she really got me help to kind of undermine me and kind of push me out of the project. She created this, what she called an advisory board for the web, where I think one out of maybe, I don't know, 6 to 8 people actually had any background in it whatsoever. And later, she actually omitted or excluded me from that committee, even though it would have been important for me to give updates. So I asserted myself and got on that committee, going through my actual boss. And then she badmouthed me at a meeting I had to leave early from because I had a conflict. She later used it against me that I didn't follow a procedure that was never established for just swapping out a news story on the homepage, something very petty that I was doing all the time. There was no process in place for. She decided to give me a written warning after I spoke up to her, the head dean, because there was just no reasoning with her. It was very clear that she was manipulating and trying to sabotage me. So, at every turn I went to the organization, whether it was the head dean who was an interim dean, I went to HR, I went to, they had a faculty staff advocate. A bunch of us actually went to some of these different channels. All of us were women. And at no point was anything done. I think I stayed maybe, I'm not even sure, maybe it was 2 to 3 months until I found another role, left, heard that she had been laid off after that. But, a lot of people suffered until they actually listened and did anything about it. It took a new dean coming in to, at that point I had another job lined up. I wrote him a letter about what was happening, and then found out from a coworker or former coworker at the time that she had been let go. And so I was I couldn't believe that. I mean, to me, it felt like very strong sexism, even though
Mhm.
I was being bullied by a woman. She was all about her own power and control, and I thought,
Mm.
if this is happening to me as a white woman, what are women of color experiencing? What is this like for other people um, who I felt in that situation like she was going after women because our
Mhm.
voices weren't taken as seriously as some of the men who worked at the school. And so, I just, I didn't necessarily, although I found out since then that I may have been able to sue for sexism.
Mhm.
But I also just wanted to walk away from them as an entity because it was very clear that at all levels that employee well-being was not a priority for them. So, shortly after that, I found a professor who was working on this. Eventually, went to different organizations over the past decade because, wanting better alignment with the bill language and
Mhm.
or the values of the organization. But yeah, it really started with having um no recourse for what happened to me. No, I at least felt that, sadly, first of all, knowing that she was bullying other people actually gave me some peace on the one hand because I wasn't internalizing it as much as I know that I would have,
Mhm.
had that not happened. But at the same time, she was bullying maybe 6 of us, and
Wow.
there was nowhere to turn. Even,
Yeah.
it she was we went individually to report. We weren't even, like, positive what each other had experienced.
Yeah.
So it was very siloed in the way that we were dealing with it. I mean, in hindsight, I probably would have, reached out to these people or the ones that I knew of and gone with them to
Mhm.
HR or to the faculty advocate. But even, on my way out, after talking to the faculty staff advocate, um, I sent a letter to the provost's office, and she helped me tweak it. And I remember distinctly at the end saying something like, "Thank you for addressing this." And she said, "What makes you think they'll address this?" And I just,
Whoa.
yeah, I mean, so it had been very apparent that a lot of people probably come to her, um, and
Mhm.
there's nothing she can really do.
What did that feel like, though? I mean, even when we talk about the trauma that we have experienced, people say, "Well, it was just a job. Get over it. Move on." But unless you've really been through a traumatic experience like this, it lives with you forever, and people really don't have an idea of how the trauma continues to be traumatized, or at least your life, if you will, because there's so many triggers that come out of nowhere that your body reacts to it. What was the physical as well as maybe the emotional health issues that you believe you got as a result of the emotional trauma?
I definitely had sleepless nights. I was definitely ruminating about this all of the time. I know that the relationship that I was in at the time, I know it affected that.
Mhm.
I think had I not seen it happen to other people, like I said, may have recognized it may have gone on a lot longer than it did.
Mhm.
Um, but I think what really bothered me the most in going on to other jobs after that was this I think it became clearer and clearer that if you are part of a certain demographic, you look the part of leader, you get the power, and that affects your health, that affects your paycheck, that affects, every, you know, almost every aspect of your well-being. And so, it really bothered me that I could see so blatantly in jobs after that,
Mhm.
um, if with the jobs that I had, if you were a tall white man, you were in a leadership position. And um, it just, I think coming into the workforce, I expected things to be a lot more progressed than they were.
Mhm.
I can't say that it was, that in high school or college I didn't see signs um,
Yeah.
of sexism and racism, but I think they were a lot more in my face once I got into the
Mhm.
workforce.
Yeah.
And it just became clearer and clearer how rigged the system is in favor of the people who write the rules. So I think that bothered me
Gotcha.
more than anything else. I think
Mhm.
my healing, um, I feel like I recovered okay. I think
You go through therapy or anything like that, or you just kind of figured it all out on your own?
I was in therapy to kind of figure out just my relationship with power in general,
Mm.
or people misusing their power in general. And that was really helpful, although it did take a long time to kind of get to a place where I felt like I had progressed or had some like
Mhm.
aha moments in that. Um, but I mean, it's, I guess, like 14, 15 years later, and I'm still working on this. So I
Oh,
feel like there's still a part of
mhm.
me that might, be healing from it because it's still, I don't know. I don't know if we can ever going through that trauma or just the trauma of sexism in general, or, at least in my case, I'm not sure that we can ever like fully feel fully feel healed from that.
Yeah.
So I feel like, um, even though we might never like see progress or feel progress, even though, it would be huge to pass,
Mhm.
um, legislation around this, I feel like just giving people a platform for their
Yeah.
voice, and,
Mhm.
that in and of itself, telling people, even if the government does not consider
Mhm.
the damage done to you to be strong enough for consequences, we see it
Mhm.
and we see
Yeah.
you. And that, I feel like that's, if nothing else comes from this, that's like the true importance of our,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah. That's so huge because so many people say, "Well, I spoke up. I told someone in HR or I told a manager, but they didn't do anything about it. No one was held accountable, and I'm still in this horrible environment and it's not going to change." And yet, as you mentioned, this is really EWA is really a lot about support as well because we do see each other, we do hear each other, we understand each other's backgrounds and the trauma that we've all been through. And so there's an extra level of compassion and kindness that I have experienced. What has it been like for you and Vicki to create end workplace abuse? No small feat, but you all have been in the trenches because you know and believe, because of your own personal experiences, that this is a systemic issue. I call it an emotional pandemic of the
Mm.
heart.
It's been, it's definitely been a roller coaster, but it's definitely been, really rewarding to
Mhm,
help people feel seen in what they're going through and to connect with
mhm,
them on such a like human level.
mhm,
And to really, I think when we decided to go out on our own, the missing piece of what we were seeing, I mean, sometimes or a lot of times in this workplace anti-abuse space, we saw a lot of these same issues being replicated. We saw entitlement with some groups, and other groups trying to get a voice or siding with those who felt
yeah,
entitled, or and we were like, we can't be trying to fight the same thing in the same space that's doing this. I mean, the whole culture, that's the um, climate that we're all swimming
mhm,
in. But we want to acknowledge that, and we want to
mhm,
um, try to prevent, you know,
mhm,
toxic behaviors from happening. It's really a challenge because we're all so ingrained with
yeah,
these systemic issues, but I think acknowledging them is the first step, figuring it out together, being okay with making mistakes. And I really feel like, I don't know, in the last, I guess, 15 years or so that I've been working on this, I have not seen a group come together taking action together like I have with this. I mean,
Mm,
it's clear that, you know, we have a strong group of people who
mm,
want this to move forward, and um, who aren't necessarily, we all have our personal reasons of like wanting some form of justice around what we went through, but um, we're not also trying to like preserve personal. We're trying to like fight the system and walk the talk in the
yes,
space that we're in. So, even if,
absolutely.
make mistakes around that. That's the goal. That's the awareness that we have.
Yeah.
So,
You
um,
know what I love the most about EWA is, I had been on this journey since 2020 when I literally walked off the job and never walked back into the station. I just walked away, and had my attorney call them and say, Andrea's never coming back because it just was so toxic and nothing was being done. And I couldn't wrap my head around why accountability was not important. And when I realized after going through therapy for about a year and a half, she just said, well, you have two options. You can stay, but 9 times out of 10, the environment will not change. So then your other option is you have to change your environment. And so, I made that leap of faith. I took that leap of faith. So here I am on the internet, just trying to learn everything I could because I finally heard the phrase workplace abuse in therapy. I'd never heard of it before. And I
mhm,
know that when people hear it, they're like, what do you mean workplace abuse? However, let's talk about this. You know, it's been very prominent in the news as of late over the last couple of really since December when Cassie, who we know was dating Diddy, she filed a civil lawsuit against him. They settled out of court within a day of the announcement. I believe it was on a Thursday. That Friday it was settled. So then fast forward to 2024, and more people began to come out. And he then said, well, you know what? People are, they're ruining my reputation. They're trying to bring me down. I'm not going to let this character assassination continue. And then all of a sudden, the video came out. Do you think there is a disconnect between sexual assault slash abuse and workplace abuse? Because people don't believe that workplace abuse is prevalent. And yet I say abuse is abuse. The abuse that we're experiencing is not visible. I call them, it's an invisible bruise. It's a bruise of our minds. But how do we encourage more conversation? How do we normalize the conversation about this invisible bruise that people can't see so they don't readily believe us when we tell them the truth? Even armed with evidence, people still don't believe it. So this is something that we necessarily can't show with video. How do we reconcile that and get people to understand the severity that this is still abuse and it's just as serious as sexual assault and sexual abuse?
I think the more we educate people, the better outcomes we have. I think that that's been one of our big takeaways over the years is that,
Yeah.
obviously we're trying to pass legislation, but so much of this, and I had the same experience as you that like when I just finally discovered the term, for me, it was workplace bullying. I was like, this is it. And I like had no idea this was a thing until, even though I had experienced it at my previous job. And, I think once people discover that term and understand the basics of it, then then they can spread the word. And I think it's, for me, this has always been an issue of we have to make this a household term. Like at some point
Yeah.
in our history, domestic abuse was not a household term, and then we
True.
people
Mhm,
kept educating other people, and
mhm,
finally, we I hope that if people are going through it, they recognize some basic signs. They can at least recognize a term that they can look up and get more information on.
mhm.
And I do think all of these forms of abuse are interconnected. I mean, the the culture that we're in is white supremacist, patriarchal. Like if you are a white man, heterosexual, cisgender, Christian, all of these things that are normalized, if you were anything off of that, it is a tool that people in that group use, or workplace abuse is a tool to oppress people and keep their standing in that power group and then keep everyone else out of it. So, and whether that's, in the home, in the family, with domestic partnerships, or in the workplace, or I mean, I really can't think of many other types of trauma that I'm sure there are some out there, but so many types of trauma are interconnected that
Yeah.
you think about, like, I don't know, sexual exploitation, or I'm just trying to think. I actually went through an internship this year, like focusing on these things, and I'm drawing a
Yeah.
blank. So many of the types of traumas
Mhm.
that we looked at were just different forms of, power and oppression
Mhm.
to maintain power. So, and it was always, or almost always, revolved around white supremacy and around the patriarchy. So, I feel like in all of these situations, um, there is some kind of, maintenance of the system that is preventing
Yeah.
things from moving forward, or even, you know, in the course of these years, looking at the way anti-discrimination law works, I didn't even realize till recently that discrimination is not explicitly defined in the law. So it's been, the courts have been able to push back on it and say, all right, well, we're going to move this from looking at impact to intent, and then really raise the threshold. And it's like, okay, well, now you've just, you know,
You've eliminated so many other people who might want to bring a claim because they've actually experienced the discrimination, especially if it's racially motivated. But because, we've moved from impact to intent, it's impossible. It's almost impossible for anyone to prove that what you did was intentional, because the government says, well, the only two ways from a racial perspective that you can prove that is, well, did they call you the N word, or did they leave a noose on your desk? And I'm like, well, they're the nuances of racism and discrimination. I mean, they're varied, and you can't, those are not the only two ways that you can be discriminatory on a racial, racially, that is.
yeah.
How do we, is this about us? I know we're going to talk about the WPSA, but on a larger scale, the WPSA, would that help kind of eliminate that and really give more protection for people of color, for BIPOCs?
That's the goal. Through the bill language, we've focused on the behaviors that will, um, if you are in a workplace where the behaviors will be enough for a reasonable person to deem it a toxic work environment, then it will be enough for a legal claim. So, I know people say that that's vague, and we also know that anywhere along the legal process, if there's not enough evidence, they will not be
Mhm.
able to go further in it. But right now, um, the only real recourse anyone has are those that, like, having a really strong case with a smoking gun around a discriminatory offense, um,
Mhm.
or kind of asking for trying to negotiate a severance, and trying to get some sort of settlement. And I know that's, still on the table, but I think it's a huge problem that we as a society don't say that, this is this damage to people matters. So, people will, in my opinion, that once we focus on the behaviors through the law, it will, first of all, strengthen the law for anyone who feels that they've been discriminated against, but also open up protections for people who can't necessarily make a strong connection, or maybe there isn't a connection, but they still have suffered from the same, or similar damages, but
Mhm.
their suffering wouldn't matter under even stronger anti-discrimination law. So looking at the data around who's getting bullied, um,
Mhm.
and it is predominantly people of color and women. Not to say that, white men can't be bullied, but
Right.
I think with that discriminatory impact, it shows a pretty clear, it shows pretty clearly that anti-discrimination law isn't doing its job. It's not strong enough. We don't. I mean, even looking back at the last 50 years, the fact that the social hierarchies at work really haven't been disrupted.
Mhm.
It's telling us that that hasn't done its job, and by intention, it hasn't done its job. Like, the people in power push
Exactly.
back at it. So I think um, if we can put the pressure on and be more vocal around, what needs to be done, I think that's what's going to move the needle.
Do you feel as if, I don't know about you, but I feel like there's something in the air? For some reason, it feels as if this is more than a moment, but that we're really moving into a movement. I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, in addition to the Cassie Diddy situation, we had Miss Teen USA said, you know what? I'm out. This culture is toxic. And I think people were like, wait a minute, you've only been the queen for 2 or 3 days. And what do you mean? And she says, I was bullied. And I think people, again, are still so surprised by that. Some people at the FDIC just recently stepped down because of allegations of, of course, sexual abuse, things of that nature, but also the toxicity. And again, the WPSA, for so many people who were thinking, well, we don't need a new law. Well, we clearly need one because, as you mentioned, we're not being protected when it comes to bullying and workplace abuse. So the question is, with the WPSA, how do we calm people's fears, especially companies who say, oh, that's anti-company. This is more red tape for us. This is more, bureaucratic BS for us. And, it's going to be, people are going to file false claims against us, and we're going to be litigating instead of being productive in our companies. How do you respond to those claims and
Um,
the pushback? Because this is a huge pushback.
yeah, I mean, so there's a bunch of ways. I mean, first is when the OSHA Act was passed around physical hazards, there were the same concerns around that the floodgates of litigation were going to open up, and that didn't happen. People complied. The organizations typically complied with the law. So that's the first, even though there was that same, like, the sky is falling type of, like, fear,
Mhm.
it just didn't happen. Um, and then I'm trying to, like, remember all the things that you said, but the other thing is that organizations already have processes, or they should have processes in place for dealing with discrimination cases. And we know that those aren't being dealt with properly. We know that any or a lot of times when somebody comes forth with a discrimination claim, going to HR thinking, okay, they trained us in anti-discrimination, they're hopefully going to be on my side with this, and then the HR, acting on behalf of the employer, really just looks at that complaint to see, can I protect my liability in this? They're there to
Yeah,
protect.
getting their liability.
Um,
Absolutely.
so that whole process is one of the big challenges in this. But in theory, companies should have a process in place. So for the companies who are doing the right thing, all they have to use is the same process they're already using for anti-discrimination law, and expanding it to complaints of bullying, which, in my opinion, discrimination is one form of bullying.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it is bullying. So um there's no reason why, I mean, it will possibly be more cases, especially in the early stages. But if companies are doing the right thing, and they care
Yeah.
about their work culture, then that will, I've heard of cases where, um, people might complain, or there might be more complaints initially, but they'll subside once the work culture is known to be healthy.
Healthy workplaces is the goal. Next week, Deb shares more about how the Workplace Psychological Safety Act will protect both employees and companies.